Good morning, guys, and welcome to the first session of this particular course, in which we are looking at, going through Unit 1, preparing to work as a home-based child carer. Now, this particular qualification, just a brief background, which I want to do before I get into it, is a qualification that we are looking at studying, and this is the NCFE Cash Level 3 Award in preparing to work in home-based childcare. Now, this has two units. That is, just to give you a brief overview, this has two units that you're looking at covering, and these two units, will be having a number of learning outcomes. So what we want to be able to do is essentially look at going through this in a bit more detail. Good morning. So what we are looking at in this particular qualification is two units that we are looking at covering. One is the NCFE. This qualification is the NCFE Level 3 Award in preparing to work in home-based childcare. Now, there are two units, as I mentioned. One is Unit 1, preparing to work as a home-based carer, that you see on your screen, and that is what we're going to start discussions on today. And the second unit is going to be exploring the role of nanny. Now, there are three units in total. One mandatory unit, which has about 9 learning outcomes that we're going to cover today. Not all of it today, but we're going to look at successive lectures to look at covering all these learning outcomes. There are 9 in total in this unit. The second unit that you have to cover has to be chosen from a list of optional units. Now, there are 2 optional units in the qualification. One is preparing to set up a home-based childcare business, and the other is exploring the role of a nanny. Now, generically, if you're, as a business owner, trying to set up a home-based childcare business like a nursery or an after-school club, or anything to look at a child, looking after children in early years as a childcare setup, then you might also be looking at taking up that unit, and that will be preparing to set up a home-based business, because that unit would tend to give you more insight into what is required to set up the home care business. And in such cases, that might be more useful for people who are looking at starting something of their own in terms of a business venture. Excuse me. The other unit, which typically a lot of people end up doing, is the role of nanny, exploring the role of nanny, and that's his Unit 3. So in order to achieve this qualification, you have to do the mandatory unit, which is Unit 1, and one of the optional units, either Unit 2 or 3. Popular-wise, job-wise, skills and qualification-wise, and obviously good from a point of view of job perspective, a lot of people would choose the Unit 3, which is exploring the role of nanny. And in this, you would be looking at understanding the roles and responsibilities of how you would work as a nanny or a carer at home and working with children. And in that case, this particular unit, which is Unit 3, tends to be more functional and more useful. That unit has 4 learning outcomes. So we'll be looking at covering that in subsequent lectures, in that qualification. Now, people who essentially look at getting into this particular qualification, if I very briefly look at showing you the website, I think people who look at getting into this particular qualification are essentially looking at working, predominantly as registered childminders. They look at working as childminding assistants, nannies, au pairs, and other childcare kind of setup in any sort of a home-based setting. That means you're able to work and take care of children working from home or from somebody's home. Now, in terms of the coverage of this qualification, we'll be looking at obviously covering all of these units, Unit 1, 2, and 3, and these would essentially be covered through Zoom sessions, as we are doing one today. And each session would typically look at covering 1 or 2 learning outcomes, depending on the time and obviously how the scheduling has been done with regards to your teaching and learning. Now, today we are going to be looking at the first unit and the first learning outcome, which is preparing to work as a home-based child carer. In this, we are looking at covering just the first learning outcome today. But the main objective of this particular unit is to understand how what are the basic rules, regulations, and obviously mandatory guidelines that you need to follow through or have a good knowledge and understanding of in terms of, working as a home-based childcarer. Now, this qualification, as I mentioned to you, prepares learners to set up or work within a home-based childcare setting as a registered childminder. There are lots of jobs on offer currently from various councils wherein they are looking for registered childminders, and this is one of the qualifications that would help you, secure that particular job. It is suitable also for learners who are employed, obviously, in the home-based childcare settings, such as childminding assistants, home carers, which are looking at nannies and essentially au pairs. Now, the assessment for these units, any unit that you study under this particular course, will all be based on assignments. There will be a portfolio in some cases required to be produced. That is basically showing some practical, application of your understanding of knowledge and theoretical frameworks, laws and legislation that you would essentially go through with me as your tutor in this particular course. Now, this is a knowledge only qualification. That means there is no placement required actually in real sense to be able to do this qualification. So after completing this qualification, you are able to then take up roles and positions working as a registered childminder or as a childcare assistant, or work as nanny, or work in any sort of a childcare setting like an after school club, as I mentioned, or a nursery. Now, from a point of view of going into a bit more detail, what I would essentially do in terms of ensuring that you have a very good understanding of what is required. One would be that obviously we'll go through the presentations. Second would be some additional reading material that I would provide. This will be a combination of material coming in from website and ebooks, which is a part and parcel and available on the Moodle, and that would allow you to comprehensively cover some of the topics and the required areas that we will cover through learning outcomes in each of the unit. Obviously, the qualification is developed in a way wherein it allows learners to, study online. Obviously, you can take as long as you want to complete this qualification, but generally speaking, we would see learners completing this in about 8 to 12 weeks, considering if they are doing live sessions with us and tutorials and tagging along in terms of completing some part of the portfolio or assignments as we go along. Now, in Unit 1, just very briefly, we are looking at, this is a theoretical unit. So here, most of it will be knowledge-based, and you're looking at understanding things about legislation, regulation relating to home-based childcare, safeguarding, how to look at child protection, health and safety in general. When you look at working in a home-based environment, childcare environment, you're looking at understanding equality, diversity, and inclusion. And then you're also looking at going into details of day-to-day care routines for children. How do you work in partnership with some of the local agencies when you are looking after children or providing childcare, or any role that you are undertaking under the childcare settings, and working in partnership with local councils, other providers, and agencies. You'll also be looking at getting some knowledge about children's learning and development. So early years to, when we say early years practitioners, EYE, from ages 0 to 2 to 2 to 5 till they go into a nursery or some sort of a school setting. You'll be looking at activities around play and the role of observation when children are playing in a home-based setting, or obviously, growing up with the knowledge of understanding how they start using their sensory, motor, and other movements. So this unit and the learning outcomes that we are going to go through, 9 of them, essentially would focus on each of these aspects and the areas that we are going to look at in the understanding and reading of this particular unit. Today, we are going to start off with understanding of going into learning outcome 1, which essentially focuses on understanding current legislation, regulation in relation to home-based childcare. Now, in order to do so, what I would do is, obviously in our discussions, we'll be making use of the presentations. These presentations are created in order to provide an outline and obviously cover some of the content of the unit and the indicative contents specific to each of the learning outcomes. And that would allow you to also go into detail of, further understanding of what we are discussing. So let's start off with the first one. Now here, as it mentions, the learning outcome, as you can see, it says understand current legislation and regulation in relation to home-based childcare. What we want to be able to do is understand what is the current legislation with regards to home-based childcare. Now, there are various acts which have been introduced over the years by the government, and these acts typically are, legislations which you need to be aware of when you work as a home-based child carer. And some of these legislations is what I've indicated on the slide. Now, to begin with, if I look at it this way, that when we do talk about this current legislation, we are talking about certain of them which primarily are important from a children and a childminder point of view. So when we look at children in general or child in general, these legislations become important, and that is what you need to be understanding so that you are able to, provide one, you have understanding of them. Second, you understand how to use them and implement them. And third, how do these legislations, when followed properly, allow you to, prevent any harm, abuse, or neglect of children when you are actually taking care of them in a home-based setting. So one of the acts is the Children's Act of 1989, and this was established essentially to provide a fair framework for child protection in England. It obviously clearly outlines duties of parents, local authorities, and other agencies, and how they can essentially prevent harm, abuse, and neglect of children. And it helps in promoting the overall well-being of the child when they are being taken care of by a childminder or in a home-based setting. There are other acts which include the Children's Act of 2004, which looks at improving children's services by providing on and promoting early intervention and accountability for local councils. So there is a role which the local authorities play in the well-being, overall well-being of the child. And this particular act helps and empowers the councils, local councils, to be able to take appropriate action and intervene if they feel that the child is being put in harm's way, or there is a scope of abuse or neglect of children while they are in a home-based setting, either with parents or otherwise, in terms of any sort of a childcare or home-based setting. Then we have the Children and Social Welfare Act of 2017. Now, this looks at improved support for children after children, people who are looking after children and care leavers. So it regulates social workers. Now, there is a lot of social support provided by the council in terms of childcare and housing. And generally, when we look at the provision of childcare, what we also see is that the government and the local authorities typically, do provide regular visits, which happen, to homes of parents, or obviously foster parents, or in some cases when children are in foster care. And in such cases, in order to regulate the workers who visit, and they are also bound by certain guidelines, this particular act essentially ensures that the councils are able to regulate, social workers who go and make these periodic checks. Human Rights Act of 1998 obviously provides fundamental freedom and rights, and this is something which is every citizen in the UK is entitled to this, and this is looking after protecting the citizen from any sort of a harm, abuse, or neglect which can happen. And this is a particular general act, but it also applies in the case of childcare when we look at this particular unit. We have the Equalities Act and the Safeguarding Vulnerable Groups Act, which is obviously other pieces of legislation which have been introduced by the government, and they have parts of it which typically directly apply to the safeguarding of children, preventing them, or taking, basically preventing any sort of a harm, abuse, and neglect which children can face in in any sort of a home-based setting. Now, the legislations are especially responsible for creating a safeguarding policy and an environment in which the child is able to grow, develop, and obviously become a responsible individual as far as the society is concerned in general. Now, there are lots of other legislations also, which are a part and parcel of something that we need to understand. And these tend to be the most important, being the CARE Act of 2014. This particular act, introduced by the Parliament in 2013, essentially, ensures that care and statutory guidance is provided as a legal framework to look at providing social care in terms of, social and adult care, in terms of basically social care in terms of adults and children. Now, it places duty on the councils essentially to support and promote well-being and independence of working age disabled adults and people. And in general, they're unpaid carers if they are providing full-time care to their effective near dear ones or loved ones, and in such cases gives them more control of the care and support they need to provide in order for them to carry out their day-to-day functions. Now, there are other acts which are also there, which are related to, in general, I would say, um, the legislation and guidelines which are provided. They are all monitored and maintained through the CQC, the Care Quality Commission. And this Care Quality Commission, which has been set up, again, this is an independent body. It provides pretty much guidelines, on every aspect of it in terms of how these acts need to be implemented, used in order to prevent neglect, harm, and, abuse to children in general within these sort of settings. Now, there is a very good website link which I will share with you, which is basically about the CARE Act's fact sheet. And this particular link of the website is on the .gov website. This particular website would essentially allow you to get hold of summary fact sheets on some of these acts, which will be useful for you to have in handy. And obviously, I would suggest that you download these fact sheets. In particular, law for carers, which is something which is quite important. This is fact sheet number 8. And the reason I say this is because of the fact that there are lots of laws and legislations available, but the fact sheet 8 primarily is the fact sheet which is important because it is in the context of carers that we need to look at. And the care bill, which was introduced by the government, essentially, outlines some of these acts which are important from a point of view of your working as a home-based carer or a worker. Now, with this background in mind, let's go into a bit more detailing to cover, learning outcome 1. Now, when we look at the overall essence of learning outcome 1, what we are looking at understanding is we want to understand the provision of childcare services which you would be required to follow when you're working as a childminder in somebody's home. Now, this form of childcare that is provided by you is highly regulated because of the fact that it needs to ensure the safety, well-being, and obviously prevent children from any sort of harm, abuse, or neglect when this care is being provided in a home-based setting or in the child's own home. Now, your understanding of this legislation and how it is to be implemented, used, and utilized is very critical because this allows you to not only comply with the mandatory requirements, but also helps you in improving and providing high quality care when you're looking after children in a home-based setting. So when we do look at some of these laws and legislations or acts that we call them are essentially designed to help you, one, adhere with compliance, comply with them, and second, to also ensure that you are also then providing high quality care in a home-based setting when it is when you're working in one of the roles of being a childminder or a nanny, an au pair, or a childcare assistant. Now, some of these acts have been explained in this slide, which I've just gone through very briefly. They detail out the main points of the act. So when we look at the Children's Act of 1989 and 2004, it's primarily aimed at promoting safeguarding and promoting the welfare of children, in a home-based setting as concerned. Now, obviously, there are 5 key points that you need to be aware of from this particular act. One is when you're working within this particular role, you need to ensure that children are healthy, they stay safe, they enjoy and achieve, goals and objectives which have been set. You are able to make a positive contribution, and obviously, it also helps in the overall well-being, development of the well-being of the child. You have the Child Care Act of 2006. This is a part of the Ofsted standard, and it is clearly a mandatory requirement in the early years or foundation stage, wherein it sets the scene for development and learning for children up until the age of 5. So these are acts that you need to be aware of. Some of them that I've mentioned have also been updated, like the Data Protection Act of 2018, inclusion of the GDPR. Nowadays, obviously, the Counter-Terrorism and Prevention Act of 2015 is also to a certain extent applicable because childminders have a duty to prevent children from being drawn into any sort of terrorism or terrorism-related activities or extreme radicalization. And in such cases, this particular act, you need to be aware of this act, and obviously be aware of the guidelines, what it provides in terms of female genital mutilation, radicalization, and obviously looking at helping in promoting British values. Now, apart from this, the reason why we want to study and understand this current legislation and guidelines in relation to health and safety is and safeguarding is to look at protection and welfare of children. And also, what we also want to understand is when you work within a home-based care setting and you're working through an agency or working through a business, then this knowledge and conformance that you have towards these acts and legislation also meets one of the fundamental requirements of registration and inspections for various bodies which look at regulating and obviously maintaining this legislation across this sector in terms of childcare. So one such part is the Ofsted registration and the inspections framework. Here, home-based childminders are required to register with Ofsted or a childminding agency which has been approved by Ofsted. And this registration process also includes the early years of foundation stage and their requirements to be able to understand how do you help promote learning and development for children and follow the care standards that are defined for children up until the age of up to the age of 5. And the inspection framework typically ensures through the CQC that childminding agencies and any sort of other agencies or local authorities are regularly inspected so that they then check for the compliance and obviously the various standards which are required to be followed, and are these being followed, and are the standards in terms of care or provision for this care is being done to the required standards as specified in these acts. And these inspections obviously are rated. So you would obviously have these as surprise inspections. One is also once in 3 or 4 years. And once the inspections take place, they are looking into the standards of safeguarding, protection, and obviously, welfare of children. And finally, looking at whether these provisions which have been put in place by childminding agencies, local authorities, or as a childminder when you work, you are helping in the learning and development of children and their overall well-being. Now, what we also want to look at in general with regards to this particular learning outcome is to go into a bit of detail when we look at what is the early years foundation stage framework. This is called the EYFS framework. Now, this is a framework which is it's a statutory requirement that all registered childminders agencies and obviously such agencies or local authorities which are working in this area to provide services are aware of, and they are, when I say aware of, they have this particular standard within their organization, implemented within their organization, because this standard helps in understanding and building the foundation for learning and development for children. It also helps in assessing the learning and development of children which is happening, to maintain and obviously apprise themselves of the overall progress of how child is growing and how this early years development for the child up until the age of 5 is happening. And then it takes into account some of the welfare requirements, which ensures that the children are safe. They are, these requirements and frameworks essentially help prevent children from harm, any sort of abuse and neglect, which can happen, when they are under this particular provision of home-based care. Now, one of the other things that you will also note is that safeguarding children is also a cornerstone of home-based childcare, because there are certain child protection policies which need to be followed, and they need to be, obviously formulated and available. And in most cases, when people look at working through childminding agencies or childminding agencies and obviously work within a particular setup, they are aware of the children's protection policies, which essentially tend to comprehensively cover, safeguarding, keeping children away from harm's way, abuse, and any sort of neglect which can happen. And how do you, if you do spot that there are children which are not, which are coming in harm's way, and obviously there are gaps or areas which are not being followed, then who should you report this to? How the reporting needs to be done? And what are the preventative steps that can be taken essentially to, minimize or do away with any harm, abuse, or neglect which is happening, is specified in these policies. Now, the second important part in obviously the idea of having legislation is to look at how does it prevent the harm, abuse, and neglect of children in a home-based setting. So one of the things that needs to be followed is the health and safety regulations. This is to check if you are working within a nursery or a after-school club or any sort of a childcare based setting, then what we need to ensure is that there are proper health and safety regulations being followed. There are risk assessments which are done. There is obviously proper maintenance of hygiene and cleanliness within the premises, and there are trained first aiders if there was an incident or excuse me, if there was an incident to happen, then there are trained first aiders which can obviously quickly come to the rescue and obviously take care of any incident which has happened within the premises. So that means adequate number of staff should be trained on first aid, and they should be able to act as first responders till maybe ambulance or E&E services or other authorities are reached, or they reach the scene. So in such cases, there should be a provision wherein within the agency, within the setup, within a particular childcare setting setup or a nursery, if I put it this way as an example, there should be people who are trained on first aid and should be able to provide first aid as the first responders. There obviously we need to ensure when you're looking at taking care of children in the early years up until 5, you need to ensure that the equipment, toys, or things which are being used for learning and development are safe, they are age appropriate, and they are in good conditions. They do not cause any harm, or I would put it this way, do not cause any let's say any sort of harm to children when they are in this particular setting. So those are implemented within a particular setup in childcare setting, and these typically tend to follow health and safety regulations, policies, and procedures. There are record keeping. Record keeping, it is an important procedure which is followed within these settings, because things like attendance record, accident and incident records, child development records are all maintained so that they can be utilized for the purposes of monitoring overall progress of learning and development happening for the child in such settings. Obviously, in most cases, childminders also are required, or these setups are also required to meet insurance requirement. That means there is proper public liability insurance, employee liability insurance, policies available, which will allow for if there was an accident or an incident which tends to happen, then it allows for these accidents and incidents to be properly covered, so that if in such cases there are compensations or rehabilitation charges which need to be picked up, they can be then done through the insurance requirements route. So in order to understand the learning outcome one, the most important part is that you need to know the key legislation, and their updated current acts. For example, when we look at the Child Care Act introduced in 2004, it was updated in 2008. You look at the Data Protection Act introduced in 1998, it was updated in 2018. So you need to be aware of the current legislation and their guidelines. You need to be aware of some of the legal frameworks, which include the acts, the Early Years Foundation framework, and also looking after the monitoring and inspection frameworks with Ofsted, and requirements regards to health and safety safeguarding, which are important for the purposes of you working as a childminder in a particular setup. And obviously, regular trainings, reviews of policies and procedures, inspection allow these compliances to be checked and quality assured, so that there are no gap areas, and obviously no areas wherein things can fall through, which ensures high quality of service being provided in a particular setup. Now, the first assessment criteria, if you go across to any questions, feel free to ask through the chat route, or otherwise stop me when I'm discussing. Not a problem at all. I think the other things that we need to discuss very quickly is the the assessment criteria 1.1, which talks about the current legislation and guidelines. And these typically would be slightly repetitive because we've covered them in a bit more detail while discussing the learning outcome one overall. So there are acts that we are aware of. A couple of others that I've added is the COSH Act of 2002, which is basically related to control of substances hazardous to health conditions. So when we do look at any sort of a childcare setup, like a nursery or an after-school club, we need to ensure that there is, the space and the equipment and the materials being utilized in that location to provide these services are safe. They are not hazardous to human health, and they should not be looking. If at all, things like cleaning fluids, toiletries and other material which is required for usage by childminders, staff members, employers, and obviously to upkeep and keep these facilities clean should not fall into the hands of children which are in that particular setup. And that is where this particular act comes in, is wherein control of substances hazardous to health conditions or are kept away. So things like cleaning materials, when we look at cleaning supplies which can prevent accidents and harm to children, needs to be done away. So when we do look at the KOSH Act of 2002, what we essentially look at in this particular act is that we are looking at making sure that anything which is considered as a risk or as considered as a hazardous substance, they need to be safely stored away, and their handling and disposal needs to be done by qualified staff or people who are trained to handle such hazardous material within a particular setup. And obviously, in order to implement this particular act, you need to have risk assessment policy. You need to also look at exposure control. You need to have training being given to the staff, and obviously record keeping needs to be done along with proper signboard and notices which need to be put up appropriately in the location to ensure that nobody is put into harm's way when they are dealing with, or if there are hazardous substances that they deal with. Say, for example, cleaning of toilets can be done with bleach and other cleaning fluids. They need to be making sure that these are used by trained staff. They are not available easily, and obviously they are stored away safely when they are not required. Then there is a Food Safety Act of 1990. This sets out guidelines for safe food preparation, handling, storage, and how to protect children from foodborne illnesses. Now, one of the things that you would also come across would be when we do say foodborne illnesses, there are lots of them. So let's look at an example of these illnesses, examples of foodborne illnesses which we generally see can actually break out, or children can get affected when they are in nurseries or after school clubs. So one such thing is novovirus, infection with novovirus, which could be viral, illness. It normally comes in through gastroenteritis. It can cause nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea and fever. And this is primarily because the children are eating contaminated food, or they are eating food which has been dropped on the floor, and obviously that has been contaminated. Then you look at, some of the illnesses which can be caused by bacteria like Listeria, if I can spell this right. This primarily tends to be a digestive disorder. It can take up to 9 hours to up to 24 to 48 hours to manifest, and it can last in the body for about 1 to 4 weeks. So obviously these foodborne illnesses can essentially come from viruses and bacteria. And what we need to ensure is that when food is served, or when food is served on kitchen tops and other places, it is clean. The food is cooked in a clean and obviously healthy, clean and hygienic environment. If we deal with food which is generally provided to children in nurseries, like for example chilled food, or it's coming in from freezer, then we need to ensure that these things are not out of date, and obviously should not cause infection. So the Food Safety Act essentially outlines that if you are looking at preparing food in a particular setup and it's being handled and then given to children, then we need to ensure that it is safe for consumption and it has been prepared in clean and hygienic facilities, so that it should not cause any infection or any sort of disease or outbreak of disease within that particular setup. Then we have other, acts like RIDOR, which is primarily any accidents which can primarily happen, which is injuries, disease, or dangerous occurrences. For example, things like if there's an outbreak of diarrhea because of one child having it, and that leading to contamination within the nursery, and a lot of other children having it, when you're working as a childminder, that needs to be reported. It needs to be logged in the incident logbook, and they would be things that you need to aware of when we talk about the current legislation. Then we talked about the Children's Act of 89, 2004, Safeguarding Act, and obviously the act which is to prevent counterterrorism, and the Early Years Foundation framework. Now, these are acts that you need to be aware of, which I have covered initially in some of the discussions that we've done with the discussion of the learning outcome. The second aspect that we want to look at is the inclusion, equality and diversity. Now, Equality and Diversity Act basically looks at, it's a legislation which was introduced in general for the members of public in 2010. It basically is a legislation which shows that everybody is treated fairly, everybody is given equal opportunities, access to equal opportunities, regardless of their background, abilities, and culture or beliefs they come from. So this act needs to be implemented. You cannot discriminate or essentially, say that, no, I can't do this or I won't be able to provide this to this particular child. That would be not following the Equality Acts, and that would be essentially discrimination. So you need to be aware as a childminder that you need to ensure that you make enough adjustments in order to accommodate children with, say, for example, disabilities. And they would, when you do so, you would be looking at essentially ensuring that you're following the Equalities and Diversity Act as far as working as a childminder is concerned. So those are bits that I would suggest that you need to be aware of, specifically when we do talk about things related to equality and diversity. Now, I don't know how many of you have come across the word inclusion and what does it mean. So when we talk about inclusion essentially means that you are being included in a group, or you are following a practice wherein you are providing equal access to opportunities to and resources to every child which is being looked after in childcare. So when we talk about inclusion is essentially nothing but equal access to opportunities and resources for people who might otherwise be excluded or marginalized. And in such cases, when we do talk about the process of inclusion, what we are looking at is we are including everybody, by not taking into account any of the physical or intellectual disabilities, and thereby ensuring that people from minority groups or ethnic backgrounds are included in and also provided equal opportunities with regards to provision of childcare, in this context. So this is something that is quite important that you need to understand. And then one of the other things that is also important as an act is SEND, which is Special Educational Needs and Disability. Now, this was a code of practice established in 2015. Now, when we do talk about SEND Act of 2015, what we do get to see is that this was a guidance which was issued by the government, forced the local authorities, especially to ensure local authorities, health authorities, schools and colleges, so that they are able to provide for children which have special educational needs. And this particular thing, when I talk about the special educational needs or the SENS Acts of 2015, is a statutory guideline provided by the government in order to ensure that local authorities and schools, health authorities essentially have this provision in place, which allows children with, especially children and young people with disabilities, to get equal opportunities and access to resources so that they can carry on their process of learning and development, and obviously look at getting opportunities to be able to progress in life. So all nurseries, playgrounds, schools, and colleges in England must provide, children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities additional resources, and obviously equal opportunities and resources so that they are able to feel and work and obviously grow and learn and develop as normal individuals within the society. Now, this is something which is quite important because when we do look at the SENS Act, it basically looks at promoting the aspect of ensuring, I'll put it this way, it essentially looks at the act wherein the act essentially looks at, let me rephrase, in the fact that it looks at promoting and providing equal access and opportunities, resources to people which have disabilities. And this was specifically, introduced to look after and providing such facilities, to children and young people who otherwise might not get these facilities when they are growing up in the early years to become, independent adults or individuals. So in summary, the learning outcome one focuses on, three aspects. One is to understand current legislation and guidelines. You need to know all the acts and legislations, how they are, why they are important, and what they are essentially. The second part is it also looks into the aspects of you understanding the early years foundation stage framework, which is utilized in providing services when you work as a childminder in a particular childcare setting. Now, if I were to divide this across into three aspects, one of this area of the acts and legislations that you need to be aware of is health and safety, second is safeguarding, and third is equality and inclusion. Now, if you are able to understand and go through this in a bit more detail with the document that I provided on Moodle, that will help you comprehensively understand these acts and obviously these guidelines. The care, the fact sheets that I've sent or provided you a link of also needs to be looked at, because it will be a ready reference for you to look at these fact sheets, because it will provide you all the summary of these acts in a short and a very concise format for you to be able to follow, and obviously use it as a ready reference for future. So this brings us to the end of first learning outcome, and I hope you've enjoyed this particular session. It has been informative for you, and if you do have any questions, feel free to raise that via the email. And there is an additional article that I put in for reading, which is working together to safeguard children. This is a report which is on the .gov website. It comprehensively covers some of the CARE Act's fact sheets and also tells you about the early years foundation framework. So it's a good reading for about half an hour, 45 minutes for you to be able to get more information on what we've discussed today. So I would like to end this session here today, and thanks for joining, and I will see you in the next one. Bye for now.